As the sun dipped behind the rust-colored hills, the prairie began to glow in hues of amber and gold. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and river water. Jack Carter, a man of few words and fewer friends, rode slowly along the Snake River's edge, his weathered hat tilted low to block the glare of the dying light. Jack wasn't heading anywhere in particular. He rarely did these days. His cabin lay nestled a few miles upriver, a modest structure of rough-cut logs and solitude. It had been 3 years since he'd left the noise and fire of the war behind. 3 years since he'd turned his back on the uniform, the violence, and the blood that never seemed to wash off. He lived by the river now, trapping small game, tending a stubborn horse named Grady, and speaking only when the silence got too heavy to carry. That's when he heard it. A scream, high-pitched, desperate, close. Jack sat up straight in the saddle. His eyes, sharp as glass despite his years, scanned the trees and brush. The scream came again, this time warped by the rush of water. Without thinking, he kicked Grady into motion, the horse charging through the underbrush, hooves pounding against the earth. They rounded a bend in the river, and there she was, a young native girl, no older than 11 or 12, was trapped in the current, clinging to a splintered log caught between 2 rocks. Her legs flailed beneath the surface, her small hands white with strain. Water surged over the rocks like angry fingers, battering her with every second. Jack didn't hesitate. He dismounted before the horse fully stopped and tossed his hat aside. His boots hit the ground running, and in a single fluid motion he plunged into the freezing water. The current was fierce, biting at him like wild dogs, but Jack powered through, teeth clenched and arms driving forward. He reached the log just as the girl began to slip. Her grip faltered, but Jack caught her wrist. "Hang on, little miss," he growled through clenched teeth. With one arm locked around her and the other pulling the log for leverage, Jack kicked toward the riverbank. The water fought him, tried to suck them both under, but he was stronger, determined. He wasn't losing anyone today. With a final surge, he pulled them onto the muddy bank, both of them coughing and gasping for air. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the roar of the river and the wild hammering of their hearts. Jack rolled onto his back, soaked and breathless, staring at the sky. The girl sat beside him, clutching something around her neck, a small beaded pouch, worn but beautifully crafted. Her long dark hair stuck to her face, and her eyes, wide as the western plains, locked onto Jack's. She said nothing. Jack slowly sat up and looked at her. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough as gravel. She gave the faintest nod, her chest still rising and falling fast. He studied her a moment longer. "No shoes? Soaking wet? Alone? What were you doing out here, girl?" Still no answer. She only clutched the pouch tighter and glanced upstream. Jack looked too, seeing nothing but empty land and river. "Well," he muttered, pulling off his coat and wrapping it around her small shoulders, "you ain't staying out here." The girl looked up at him, eyes filled with a mix of fear and awe. And in that moment, though no words passed between them, something unspoken settled in the space between rescuer and rescued. Morning broke slow and pale, the first light creeping across the hills like a careful visitor. A low mist clung to the Snake River, and the world was hushed, as if even the birds knew not to disturb the stillness. Inside the small log cabin, Jack Carter stirred the embers in the stove, coaxing them back to life. The scent of coffee mingled with damp earth and pine. Up in the loft above, nestled in a tangle of wool blankets, the young native girl slept curled like a fawn, quiet, still, guarded. She hadn't spoken a word since the river, not a name, not a place, just silence. But Jack had known enough danger in his time to recognize that silence wasn't fear. It was strength. She wasn't lost. She was waiting. He had tried once the night before to get a name out of her, offered food, jerky, and leftover beans, then tried a soft voice, something foreign on his tongue. "You got folks out there looking for you?" No answer. just the steady movement of her hands over the small pouch at her neck, as if drawing power from it. Jack didn't press her. He knew what it was to carry wounds too deep for words. Now he poured 2 cups of coffee. One black for himself, and one with a bit of sugar and milk for her. Child's coffee like his ma used to make. He looked up to the loft and opened his mouth to call for her, but it was empty, blankets folded, pouch gone. No footprints, no sound. The girl had vanished like morning mist. Jack stepped outside, heart thudding. The grass was still wet with dew, and the door hadn't creaked open. She must have slipped out before first light. He scanned the open plain, the tree line, the river trail. Nothing. He walked around the cabin, eyes alert, senses honed by years of surviving men and nature alike. There was no trail to follow, no broken twigs or disturbed brush. She'd moved like a shadow. He cursed under his breath, part of him frustrated, part of him oddly impressed. Back inside, he noticed something he hadn't before. On the windowsill, a single feather, black-tipped with white edges, lay perfectly centered, deliberately placed. Next to it, the tiniest string of beads, tied in a pattern he didn't recognize but knew, meant something. Jack picked up the feather and held it between his fingers. The beads sparkled in the morning light. A sign, he muttered, but of what? He couldn't say. He sat for a long time, coffee going cold in his hands, staring out at the empty landscape. She hadn't left in fear. She hadn't run. She'd gone where she belonged. Yet something tugged at his gut, a feeling he couldn't shake, a weight, like a storm building on the horizon. That evening, Jack lit a fire outside and sat beneath. The stars. Coyotes yipped in the distance. Grady, his horse, snorted and paced restlessly in the corral. The feather and beads lay beside him on a stump. He had no way of knowing what would come next, only that the land was watching, listening, and that something had shifted. Out in the dark prairie, the wind carried faint echoes, hoofbeats far off, a rhythm ancient and full of purpose. But Jack Carter didn't know that yet. Tomorrow, 5 tribes would ride. The wind changed. By mid-morning, the prairie no longer whispered. It murmured with intent, the kind of quiet that made animals freeze and birds take flight. Jack Carter stood on the porch of his cabin, mug in hand, staring out over the wide stretch of open land that sloped toward the river. His eyes squinted against the light, scanning for what he couldn't yet see, but could feel. Something was coming. Grady, his horse, pawed nervously in the corral, snorting and flicking his ears. Jack had seen war. He'd seen cavalry charges, and desert raids and ambushes that started with nothing more than a change in the air. And this felt the same. The stillness before a wave crashes. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. Not 1, not 2. Dozens. Jack stepped off the porch and walked. Out into the clearing, dust crunching beneath his boots. He shaded his eyes with a calloused hand and looked east, toward the hills where the morning sun painted everything in gold. And there they were. A long column of riders poured over the ridge like a tide of color and motion. Horses of every shade. Painted, black, dappled, chestnut, thundered toward him, kicking up clouds of dust. At the front rode warriors, tall and proud, decked in feathers, bone, and beadwork. Their spears and staffs waved high, decorated with furs, talons, and sacred symbols that shimmered in the light. 5 banners flew above them, one from each tribe: Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Blackfoot, all riding together. That alone made Jack's heart skip. These weren't just scouts. This wasn't a patrol. This was a council. He didn't move, didn't reach for his rifle, just stood his ground, the wind tugging at his shirt and hat. He tipped his hat forward respectfully. As the riders approached, the lead horses slowed, spreading out in a semicircle around him. Dust swirled, settling over leather and fur. A silence fell. Deep, sacred. Then, from the center of the group, a horse stepped forward. Its rider was an elder, his long white braids tied with red cloth, his face etched with time. He wore a robe of elk hide and held a carved wooden staff, crowned with eagle feathers. His gaze was steady, powerful. Behind him, more elders dismounted. Chiefs, medicine men, warriors, women with braids and painted hands. One figure stood among them, a familiar small frame, wrapped in a blanket of soft red wool. The girl. She stepped forward and lifted her chin. No fear, only fierce pride in her eyes. She pointed at Jack. A younger man, perhaps a translator. One stepped beside the elder and spoke. "You are the one they call Jack Carter?" Jack nodded once. "I am." The translator turned back, speaking words Jack didn't know. The elder raised a hand. "You pulled a daughter of many nations from the jaws of the river. She is blood of all 5 tribes. Her spirit name is Little Fire." He paused. "You did not ask for reward. You asked no questions. But the spirit saw, and so did we." The elder reached into a satchel and pulled out a folded buffalo robe marked with symbols Jack had never seen before. He stepped forward and placed it at Jack's feet. Another elder laid down a peace pipe wrapped in dyed leather. Another, a painted war shield, gifted only to those who had faced death and returned. Jack stood still, unsure of what to say. The translator continued, "We do not forget debts of the heart. You saved more than a girl. You saved a line, a story, a legacy. And so we offer you a name among us." A hush fell. "You will be known as Wichasha Wakang, the sacred man, or in the tongue of your kind." The elder spoke again, his voice like rolling thunder. "River Guardian." The council had not come for words, they had come for meaning. Jack Carter stood like a post driven into the earth, arms at his sides, heart thudding beneath his worn coat. Before him, on the ground, lay more wealth and honor than he'd ever expected to see again. A buffalo robe bearing sacred symbols, a peace pipe wrapped in hand-woven leather, and a painted war shield, its surface marked with red ochre and crescent moons. None of it felt like payment. It felt older than that, heavier. Behind the gifts stood elders and warriors from 5 different nations, and beside them, the girl. Little Fire watched him with steady, unreadable eyes. In them, he saw the same river he'd pulled her from, wild, deep, and alive. The translator, a young man in a buckskin vest and turquoise necklace, stepped forward again, his voice measured and respectful. "You did not act for reward, but the spirits give gifts where honor is due." Another elder approached, a tall woman with gray hair braided in silver and blue thread. She carried something wrapped in soft fur. As she unwrapped it, Jack saw it was a knife, the blade carved from obsidian, the handle inlaid with beads and feathers, its beauty raw and deliberate. She laid it down gently atop the robe. "To cut away fear," the translator said. Next came a young crow warrior, silent and solemn. He carried a medicine pouch, small but carefully made, stitched with red thread and filled with sage, tobacco, and something Jack couldn't name. He offered it without a word, placing it into Jack's palm. "To carry the prayers of those you've protected." The 5th gift came not from an elder, but from Little Fire herself. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the grass. Around her neck was the same small pouch he had seen her clutch after the rescue, the one he thought she'd vanished with. Now she removed it slowly, reverently, and placed it in his hands. It was warm. "This belonged to my mother," the translator said, "and her mother before. You pulled it from the river. She says you carry its spirit now." Jack didn't know what to say. He wasn't a man given to speeches. Words always felt like a mouthful of dry sand. But he felt the weight of this moment, how it reached backward, into ancient times and forward into something unknown. He looked at the elders, then at Little Fire. His voice was low, gravelly, but steady. "I didn't do nothin' no man shouldn't do. She was drowning. I just pulled her out." The translator listened, then said something in his own tongue. Several elders nodded. Then the oldest among them, the white-braided elder from earlier, stepped forward again and raised his arms. Silence fell like snow. Even the horses stilled. The land has seen blood. The river has carried it. But today it carries peace. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. One by one the others followed, including the warriors, the women, and finally Little Fire. Jack hesitated, then followed suit. For a moment they were all connected by the same ground, the same silence, the same memory. When they rose, the elder spoke one final time. "You carry more than a name now, River Guardian. You carry the eyes of 5 nations." Jack nodded, the truth of it settling in his bones. He was no longer just a man alone in a cabin by the river. He had been woven into the story of the land. That night, the fire burned brighter than usual. Jack Carter sat among warriors, elders, women, and children, all circled around the flames under a star-choked sky. The smoke from the sacred fire rose straight into the heavens, as if carried by unseen hands. Around him drums tapped a slow, steady rhythm, not of war, but of memory. It had been years since Jack had sat in the company of others, longer still since he'd spoken about the man he used to be, the man he'd tried to bury along with his past. The medicine man passed a pipe around the circle, the peace smoke curling into the air like prayers in a language only the land could understand. When it reached Jack, he accepted it without hesitation, not out of custom, but out of respect. He brought the pipe to his lips, drew the smoke deep into his lungs, and closed his eyes. Memories came, slow and bitter. "I wasn't always just a cowboy," Jack began, his voice low and hoarse. The fire crackled. "I rode in the Union cavalry, thought I was on the right side of things, thought I was helping build something better." His eyes stared into the flames, but the war didn't end when it was supposed to. Not for us. Across the circle the elders listened in silence. Jack took another breath. "They sent us west, said we were bringing order to the frontier, but that wasn't it. We were clearing the land, and the ones we cleared were families, villages, camps." His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. "I saw towns burned, tents slashed, heard the cries of women and children in the night, and they're still in my ears when I try to sleep. I rode with men who smiled while doing it." His fists clenched. "I left the day I watched a boy not more than 10 take a bullet to the back, shot by a man who said it was cleaner than letting him grow up angry." Jack looked up at the stars, jaw tight. "I walked away from my command that day, burned my uniform, took my horse and rode until I couldn't see another soul. Been here ever since, trying to be forgotten." A long silence followed. No one moved. Then the Lakota elder spoke, not with pity, but with clarity. "The river does not choose what it carries, but it can choose where it leaves things." Another elder, the woman who had gifted him the obsidian knife, added, "Shame is not the same as guilt. Guilt traps. Shame teaches. You listened to it, and you changed." Jack swallowed hard. Little Fire, sitting beside her grandmother, leaned forward and whispered something. The translator smiled softly. "She says the river only returns what belongs. You belong here now." Jack didn't know what to say. For years he'd tried to forget the man he used to be. Now, for the first time, he wasn't running from it. He was sitting with it, owning it. A crow warrior handed him a blanket, woven with colors of twilight: purple, black, orange, and blue. Jack draped it over his shoulders, the weight of it grounding him. Above them, a wolf howled in the distance. Not a threat, but a signal. The past had been spoken, and the land had listened. Dawn broke in golden silence. The camp stirred slowly. As the first light touched the prairie, casting long shadows behind the circle of horses, hides, and sacred fire. Embers still glowed from the night before, the smoke rising in thin wisps, carrying the last of the council's prayers into the morning sky. Jack Carter stood on the edge of his cabin's clearing, arms crossed over a blanket still draped across his shoulders. The gifts of the tribes were neatly arranged nearby: the buffalo robe, the painted shield, the pipe, the obsidian knife. But none of those weighed on him the way her gaze did. Little Fire, now mounted on a painted horse, looked back at him. One final time. There was pride in her expression, not a child's gratitude, but something deeper. She had seen death and lived. She had seen the soul of a man the world tried to break, and she had named him worthy. Beside her rode 5 chiefs, each bearing the sacred symbols of their people. They nodded to Jack, one after another, and then turned toward the horizon. A caravan of riders began to move, hooves thundering softly across the grasslands, banners fluttering in the wind. The same 5 tribes that had once warred with each other now rode as one, united, in peace, in memory, in honor. Jack watched them disappear into the distance until the dust settled and the prairie returned to stillness. He felt different, lighter, like something had been lifted off his chest after years of carrying it in silence. The man who had ridden out of the army, broken, ashamed, and lost, was no longer the same man standing in the dirt now. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. He turned back toward the cabin. The land stretched wide around him, endless and open. The Snake River flowed gently nearby, no longer roaring with danger, but humming with a kind of song, a reminder of what it had taken and what it had given back. As he stepped onto the porch, he saw one final gift, something that hadn't been there before, a hand-carved totem left beside his door, simple, elegant. It depicted an eagle in flight, wings outstretched, above the flowing waves of a river. At its base, carved into the wood in steady, careful hand, were the words, "River Guardian." Jack ran his fingers over the grooves. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not the crooked smirk he'd worn in younger, wilder years, but something quieter, truer. He wasn't just a man who lived on the edge of the world anymore. He was part of it, a thread in a far older story, a protector, a witness, a bridge between bloodshed and peace. He picked up his rifle, not out of habit but respect, and mounted Grady. The horse snorted and shifted beneath him, ready to ride, not to escape this time, but to explore, to return the gifts, to learn the rest of the story he'd just been written into. And as he rode out into the sunlit hills, the wind carried his name across the prairie like a prayer. River Guardian, the man who chose to save when he could have turned away, the man the tribes would never forget.